I am Ellen Hanak. I'm the director of the Water Policy Center at PPIC. I want to thank you wholeheartedly for being with us this morning. Same to those of you who are on the live webcast. And let's see, it's dark here. I should have brought my glasses. So I think probably most of you know a little bit about PPIC, but for those who don't, we're a nonpartisan policy-oriented research institute with offices in San Francisco and Sacramento, and we like to work and hold events around the state as well. And this is the Water Policy Center's annual fall conference. This is the fourth one that we've done now, and we always like to come out with a short kind of policy-focused brief at the time of this event. This event is kind of timed to be before the beginning, before the legislature gets back into action. The fall is also a time when folks in the administration and folks in the water policy community are thinking about kind of their agenda coming forward. So what we've come out with this year is an update of our priorities for California's water, which is our take on kind of some of the top priorities for the state, really focusing this year on thinking about the changing climate and what that means for water management. And on the back of this policy brief and up on your screen, you can see the names of the organizations that have helped make it possible for us to have this event and to write this brief. And we just want to thank them all wholeheartedly for their support. And if you are from one of those organizations, thank you. And if you are not, thank them when you see them. And anybody who would like to contribute to donate to PPIC to help us put on these kinds of events and keep them free and accessible, there are little cards on your table that you're welcome to fill out, or just find one of my great colleagues from PPIC and let them know. So thank you for that to our sponsors. And let's see, we have event. We want you to silence your cell phones, but you can keep them. You don't have to put them in airplane mode, so you can you can live tweet if you would like. And there are a couple of hashtags: hashtag water priorities and hashtag PPIC events, if you want them to kind of coalesce and be easily findable in that way. And so let's see, other materials that will be useful to you. You've got a copy of the program with you, and that includes also more extensive bios on all of our great speakers. So we won't probably take a whole lot of time to introduce them when they're up on the stage, to give them as much time as possible to talk. We're going to have 3 great sessions after I give you a bit of an overview of some highlights from our new report. The first one is going to be really focusing on the issue of climate extremes, floods, fires, and droughts, and what that means for Californians and for our water systems. The next one is a kind of a recurring session that we've had in most years on safe drinking water solutions. This year, looking at next steps, because there was the enactment of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act. So a lot of the discussion in the last panels over the last few years have been about how to get that funding. Now the funding is approved, so we're going to be able to talk about next steps with folks from the state and at the local level. And then we've got our last session is going to be with some of the state leaders from the administration to talk about how to think about a climate resilient portfolio. So I want to move us along so that we can get to those great conversations. So I'm going to be kicking this off with a short overview. And what do I have to also tell you that later in the day you will get an email asking you to take a very short survey to tell us how we did and give us input on how to improve our events. So please fill that out. That's very helpful to us. So thank you. And here we go. I think. Do I have to? There we go. Okay. So we're going to really be focusing especially on the changing climate in this event, in this morning event. But I just want to highlight that is not the only thing that California water management needs to adapt to. This changing climate is happening in the context of continued population growth in California. We're at about 40 million now. By mid-century, expected to be at about 50 million. Mandated groundwater sustainability is a big thing now in California. This is the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The first plans are going to be due at the end of January, with implementation starting right after that. Technology is always evolving, providing opportunities. Regulations are often evolving, in some cases adding constraints, but also providing new opportunities in things like making it easier to use recycled wastewater as a water resource. And the state, federal, and local relationships and their interplay are just an important and evolving part of California water. So just a little recap on the climate pressures, since that's kind of a theme for the day. We looked at this in detail in a report that came out last year, and I'm just going to recap for you the kind of 5 pressures and why water is one of the areas at the forefront. Warming temperatures is really important for water management in a lot of different ways. Shrinking snowpack is one of those ways, because it means that we get more rain and less snow, and it means that the snow we do get melts sooner. We're also starting to see, and projections are that we're going to be seeing more and more of kind of an accentuated seasonal aspect to our precipitation, with shorter, spikier wet seasons and less reliable precipitation in the fall and in the spring. And this is actually a big factor in our fall wildfire season now, because we're just not getting rain as early as we have been in the past, and that makes it tougher in terms of fire management. More volatile precipitation, this is the sort of between different years, across years. So California has always been a pretty variable place, and actually has the most variable year-to-year climate of any state in the lower 48, maybe even among all 50, but this is expected to be increasing with drier dries and wetter wets, meaning needing to kind of, as one of our colleagues, Mike Dettinger, put it, who's done a lot of great work on climate science, we need to start thinking about managing our droughts for floods and our floods for droughts. And then rising seas is something that's going to be affecting all coastal communities in terms of their infrastructure, but it's also actually a water supply issue directly because of the delta and the need, the seas rise, the salt water wants to come into the delta, and so you got to push more water, fresh water out to keep that balance, and that means a tax on water availability. So all of these things are going to be important for California water. They're going to be really important for our infrastructure and how we manage it. The volatility just makes it harder to use our multi-purpose reservoirs for the same things at the same time, because when you've got higher, spikier runoff, that means you've got higher flood risk at the same time that you want to be saving water for the dry summer and for the next dry years. Makes it also harder to balance some of the ecosystem management, things that we do with our reservoirs. We also have an aging water grid. That's a good example, maybe one of the starkest examples of that, the Oroville spillway damage from 2017. But this grid that we manage is also based on the climate of the past. So we need to be thinking about that as we're making upgrades and investments. And then these increasing extremes affect supply and demand patterns. Not only sort of the changing patterns of runoff, but also, when it's hotter and drier, that can increase water demand, both in cities and for urban landscapes, but also for agriculture. So I'm just going to run through for you. We kind of have outlined 5 big priority areas in this new brief. So I'm just going to run through quickly, and I think we're going to get to touch on all of them in some way in the sessions later on. The first one is modernizing the water grid. And this is just a very high-level schematic of what we're calling the water grid. We think it's kind of useful parallel to the energy grid, which also has its challenges. Obviously, right now, we're very aware of that in California. And this is sort of an above-ground and an X-ray version of the grid. The above-ground, all these squiggles and dots, that's our main surface water system in California. The squiggles are the ways we move water around through rivers, aqueducts, pipelines, and the big circles are our multi-purpose reservoirs, where we store water and where we also have to keep room available for flood control. That is owned and operated by state, federal, and a variety of local organizations and agencies. And then the X-ray view on your, I have a little right-left dyslexia, on your right are our main groundwater basins, where the main ones where people live and farm. And this is kind of a map that shows you what's happening with this new Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is all of the basins that are in yellow or orange are the ones that are going to be developing and submitting plans for managing their basins sustainably and bringing them into balance. All the ones in orange are categorized as critically overdrafted, and therefore they're on the tightest timeline. They're the ones whose plans are due in January. The ones in green down there, they still also need active management, but those are places that already had developed adjudicated basins or special act districts that have been managing their groundwater longer in a more sustainable way, mainly because they started having problems sooner, and they kind of resolved some of those issues. So modernizing the grid is both fixing what's broken, kind of making the smart plays on new infrastructure investments, thinking about the changing patterns of runoff, and connecting these two pieces, these two maps, getting more water into the ground so that we have more room in our surface reservoirs to manage the floods. Second is other aspects of preparing for changing supply and demand. And the first one is really thinking about regional portfolios and really kind of the regional grid. That big map I showed you was just the very high level state kind of grid. Every region has, to some extent, a grid that you could draw it in the same way. And it turns out that when these grids are managed and when the portfolios are managed regionally in a coordinated way, it's a lot easier to get through a drought. We saw this in the last major drought that California had. We still have progress to make on this, and this is where emphasizing regional planning and smart infrastructure plays at the regional level can be really, really important. Connecting water and land use planning. This is especially important in the context of two things. One is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and especially thinking about places where some land may need to come out of production because just the amount of overdraft, it's not possible to just fill that with new supplies. Managing that transition in a smart way so that it provides benefits rather than just creating problems of dust and pests and weeds for neighboring farmland. But also thinking about connecting water and land use planning to make sure that we're not paving over the best groundwater recharge areas, to make sure that we're not putting new housing in harm's way in terms of flooding and in terms of wildfire risk. And then making it easier to trade water. That's a sort of theme that we harp on a lot at the Water Center. Being able to share water flexibly, both during droughts and over the long term, is really important for California's economy. And there are ways to do that can be broadly beneficial. It has to be done responsibly, but it can be really an important aspect, especially in the context of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So the third, and we're going to have a whole panel on this, providing safe and affordable drinking water. I mentioned we now have the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act, which is going to be providing $130 million annually for 10 years to help kind of fill some of the funding gaps that are specifically related to ongoing operations and management costs in poor communities that cannot afford to pay for the solutions themselves. What these maps show you is both the quality challenge. The map on the left, these are communities that were violating at least one maximum contaminant level for a primary contaminant as of last summer, about 300 of them. Most are groundwater, but there are some places that have surface water quality violations as well. And then on the right, you've got communities facing shortages during the last drought. That's another piece. It doesn't affect as many people, but it's really important in terms of thinking about how to build drought resilience. So both of these things are areas where local solutions are going to be really, local participation is going to be really important, but the state has a leading role to play. And I'm looking forward to hearing from our great panel on that. The next one, the fourth one, is thinking about our headwater forests. We've had a team that's been working on these issues for the last few years, and kind of looking at, there's a fairly broad consensus on the need to do something in our headwater forests, which have become too dense. We lost a lot of trees during the drought. to just the climatic conditions and beetles. And there's a recognition broadly that we need to pick up the pace and the scale of management on what are mostly federal lands. We're talking about in the Sierra and Cascade headwater forest areas. Most of that land is owned by federals, but there is also some land owned by smaller private forest owners. They need new tools to be able to kind of leverage and pool together and benefit from economies of scale. So we're suggesting things like forest improvement districts that might be able to help them. It will be valuable to identify all of the benefits and beneficiaries of the management of forests. There are many, and actually our team is going to be coming out with a report early in 2020 that kind of seeks to look at that. And what we're starting to find, just to give you a little preview, is that there are a lot of benefits across the board from the same action. So there's really an opportunity to coordinate and kind of pool resources to tackle that. And then stretching available funds. And I have intentionally included here a picture of mechanical thinning. This is, there are ways to manage forests, including through prescribed burn, but also through selective thinning of forests with harvesting techniques. And some of these techniques can actually generate revenue. So to the extent it's possible in places to combine those, it can be a way of stretching funds and generating revenues for the folks that are doing the management. So fifth is improving the health of our freshwater ecosystems. And we've been doing some work on this. This was one of the areas that was most impacted by the latest drought. And we're not really out of the woods, even though we've had a couple of good wet years since then. A lot of effort and energy around the state is focused on trying to crack this nut and solve this problem. What we're suggesting is that it's really important to move beyond the sort of very project-specific, species-specific kinds of approaches to trying to really manage for ecosystem health, which is not forgetting the species that we're managing for, but looking at this stepping back and looking at this in a broader watershed scale context. Using new tools, we've been talking for a while about giving the environment a water budget, sort of like a water right. We don't use the word water right, but it's sort of like one, that gives flexibility to manage for droughts, to store, to trade, and gives the environment a seat at the table in a different way, rather than just being the sort of regulatory constraint, more a player along with everybody else that can think about creative solutions. And then anticipating and preparing for change, and this means thinking about some of the things that are starting to hit us now, like harmful algal blooms, and what that means for how we want to manage environmental water and the habitat, the way we connect water and land. So these issues all come together in all of our watersheds, but especially in our two biggest watersheds from a water supply perspective. We have in the report a little bit of a discussion, sort of breakout page on each of these, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Basin, including the Delta, but also the two big river areas, and then the Colorado River Basin, where there's been some progress made in the last year, but some big challenges ahead. And what we kind of highlight in all of this is thinking about four principles, and this was something that we suggested to the Newsom administration, folks who are drawing up the resilience portfolio, but I think it's relevant not just for the state and where the state can kind of encourage action, but it's really also very relevant for all of us as we work on water issues at the local level, at the regional level, and statewide from the perspective of various stakeholder interests. So one of them is flexibility. Flexibility to manage, increase volatility, and to build resilience. So the more we can kind of construct options that allow folks to not be locked into a very specific way to do something, the better. Incentives, this kind of goes along with that. Incentives to, and I think this is especially for individual water users and for local agencies, to implement smarter and more flexible management. Things like groundwater recharge, make it easier to do that. Alignment across agencies, and I would say this is an important message for the state, and I know the state is interested in this, but it's also important for thinking about that whole ecosystem of federal, state, local, regional players that are involved in water and looking to align the requirements for getting approvals to trade water, recharge aquifers, restore ecosystems. We hear in one meeting after another that restoring ecosystems, some of those projects are the hardest ones to get approved because of all of the permitting requirements from different agencies. So finding ways to kind of pull those together could really save money and time and get us better outcomes. And then finally, and this is a theme already that was in the governor's executive order, calling for the resilience portfolio, is looking for multi-benefit approaches. And it sounds nice and everything, but it really is, when you start looking at the examples around California, where we get a lot of things done is when people really do this, look at, okay, how do I stack my benefit with your benefit, and it allows you to get more cooperation on projects, but it also allows you to leverage more sources of funding, which is always in short supply. So I will leave you with a beautiful photo by our colleague Lori Pottinger, and there's a door prize for anybody who finds the guy fishing up there, maybe. Thank you very much. And I'm going to call up now the next panel, and Van Butzik, who's our colleague, adjunct fellow at PPIC, who's at UC Berkeley in Cooperative Extension. Thank you.